Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Stewarding Our Wetlands, Legal Tools, Conservation Solutions, and Citizen Science in Nova Scotia. We will hear some more land acknowledgements later, but I do want to start things off by acknowledging that this event, although it's virtual, is being hosted in Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725, and these treaties did not deal with the surrender of land, but they did set out the rights and responsibilities that settlers and Mi'kmaq people owe to one another. So, as such, we are all treaty people. So today's webinar is actually part of Nova Scotia's third annual Wetlands Appreciation Week. And there are many other fun events going on this week that you can also take part in. So I would encourage you to check out the full event schedule. And you can find that by visiting the Ecology Action Center's website. And I will also paste a link into the chat if you'd like to check that out. And just some brief introductions before we get started with the presentation. So my name is Cass Harris, and I've been working as a coordinator with the Nova Scotia Environmental Network for the past 3 years, on and off now. Over that time, my role has evolved quite a bit, and it's included things like coordinating NSEN's provincial environmental caucuses, organizing events and webinars like this one, supporting our communications and fundraising efforts, and more. Um, so NSCN is a network of about 50 environmental organizations across the province whose common purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural environment and build a sustainable future for Nova Scotia. So at the organization, we strive to support, strengthen, and promote the environmental work of our members by connecting them to each other, to governments, and to the public. I am hosting today's webinar on behalf of the Nova Scotia Biodiversity Caucus. And if you're unfamiliar with the concept of a caucus, it's basically a recurring series of meetings between those who share a common environmental priority. So in this case, biodiversity. One of the most effective ways for NSEN to connect members of the environmental community is through the formation of environmental caucuses like this one. So caucus members will join monthly or bi-monthly meetings with those working in, volunteering in, or interested in issues related to biodiversity. At a caucus meeting, you can expect to network and learn about current and upcoming biodiversity-related projects, programs, and events from across the province. So really the main purpose of these meetings is just to promote collaboration and advance biodiversity work being done in Nova Scotia. So our next meeting is scheduled for August 27th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., and we would love to have you. Anyone who's passionate about protecting biodiversity can join. So whether you're a representative from a nonprofit organization, an Indigenous organization, a government body, academic, or simply somebody who's eager to make a difference, you're welcome to participate in the group. We do have a short interest form, and I can add a link to that in the chat if you're interested in checking it out, or you can send us an email at biodiversity@nsenvironmentalnetwork.com, which I'll also pop into the chat if you'd like to receive some more information. So finally, I'm very happy to welcome two incredible guest speakers. We have Rochelle Martin joining us. Rochelle is a staff lawyer with East Coast Environmental Law, and Gwendolyn Clark, who is the Marsh Monitoring Field Coordinator with Birds Canada. So now I will hand it over to our first speaker, who is Rochelle Martin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cass. Thank you for the intro. And thank you everyone for joining today. I hope everyone is staying somewhat cool. So I'm really excited to be joining you today as part of Wetland Appreciation Week. As Cass said, I'm a staff lawyer with East Coast Environmental Law. And we also have our summer law student, Hennessy Salem, on the call today, and my coworker, Mike Kofal, who is another staff lawyer. Okay, I'm just trying to change the slide. There we go. So thank you, Cass, for the land acknowledgement. I'll just say that I'm calling from Fredericton, New Brunswick today, which is in the Wolastoqey territory. And that as a regional charity, East Coast Environmental Law works across all of the Atlantic provinces. So we do work in other unceded and unsurrendered territories as well, including the Inuit, Innu, Pescona-Magadi, Mi'kmaq, and historically the Beothuk. For those of you who don't know much about East Coast Environmental Law, we are a public interest environmental law charity. And so our vision is a future where laws and legal systems protect ecological health and promote environmental and climate justice in our region. And so to get to that vision, we advocate for progressive law. So we participate in law reform efforts. We provide public legal education like this, and we support others who are working on addressing or redressing environmental harms. And to find out more, you can visit our website. I put the link there on the slide. So today, I'll be covering briefly some of the regulatory tools in Nova Scotia that are in place to protect wetlands, and I'll cover a couple conservation options for landowners who may be interested in formally protecting wetland habitat. And then Gwendolyn's going to join us from Birds Canada to give a presentation on their MarshWatch and Marsh Monitoring Program. And we do have about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So feel free to, if you're looking for more information about anything we discussed today, feel free to ask. And as Cass mentioned, this event is part of several World Wetland Appreciation Week events. And so you can find out more information about other events at the link on the slide there at Ecology Action Center's website. So wetlands are a critically important part of our natural systems, and Gwendolyn's presentation is going to get into a little bit more details on some of the reasons why wetlands are so important. And to kind of recognize the importance of wetlands, we have laws and policies that have been developed to protect wetlands at all levels of government. Due to the limited time that we have today, I'm going to focus on a few of the key laws and policies that the province of Nova Scotia has. And when looking at these frameworks, so I'll cover a few details from the Environment Act, from the Nova Scotia Wetland Conservation Policy, and from the Forests Act's Wildlife Habitat and Watercourses Protection Regulations. And when looking at these different frameworks, something to keep in mind is that the acts and regulations are legally binding, so they're legally enforceable, while policy documents like the Wetland Conservation Policy is not legally enforceable. So the protections that we have in acts and regulations are the stronger form of protection. However, the policies are still important in guiding government decision-making under those legal frameworks. And this isn't a comprehensive list of all of the all of the laws that relate to wetland protection in Nova Scotia, but just a few of the key ones that I'll cover with the time that we have today. So the first, the Environment Act, is the province's primary statute for regulating activities that could impact wetlands. And the Act provides the Minister of Environment and Climate Change with the responsibility to steward water resources in the province, including wetlands. And the Act does define wetland, so anything that meets this definition would be included in the regulations of the Act. And so essentially it's land that is periodically covered in water, and that also sustains aquatic processes that are that make it a wetland. And Gwendolyn will talk a little bit more about some of these features. And so under the Environment Act, the different protections for wetlands come in the form of prohibitions, so prohibiting certain activities that might be harmful, standards, so allowing activities but ensuring that they're done in a certain way or that they're done within a certain distance of the wetland. And then there are requirements for approval before an activity can happen, or a requirement to notify the department that an activity is going to be taken on. And by department, I'm referring to the Department of Environment and Climate Change. So the Environment Act has a general prohibition prohibiting anybody from releasing a substance into the environment that could have a negative impact on the environment without an approval. So this applies to not only releasing substances into wetlands, but releasing substances into the environment that could be harmful. However, this does also apply to wetlands, and so protects wetlands from harmful substances. And the Act defines adverse effect as any effect that either damages the environment or that changes the environment in a way that negatively affects aspects of human health. So any releases that have this adverse effect would be prohibited unless the activity was permitted or approved by the department. There's also a general prohibition under the Act. Anyone is prohibited from starting any activity that is designated under the regulations without approval. And so the activities designation regulation under the Act lists which types of activities require approval, and wetland alteration is one of those activities that requires approval, with certain exceptions. But generally, if an activity is going to alter a wetland, then an approval is required. And when thinking, what does altering a wetland mean? The department has clarified that that refers to any activity that could affect the wetland's function and habitat. And so it's quite broad. And there are two different types of applications for altering wetlands under the Act. So the first is for any alterations that would impact less than 2 hectares of wetland, and those activities would require a wetland alteration application to be submitted to the department and approved. And the second is for larger impacts that would exceed 2 hectares, which require an environmental assessment, which is a much more rigorous review of the environmental impacts of the activity. And wetland alteration approvals, when they're issued, they would typically come with terms and conditions attached. And so the holder of the permit would have to follow those terms and conditions when carrying out the activity. When the department is deciding whether to grant an approval, the Environment Act requires the minister to consider whether the proposed activity would violate any government policies, and this includes the wetland conservation policy. So while the policy is not itself legally enforceable, there is a requirement to consider the policies under it. And there's a requirement for the department to make all wetland alteration approvals public. And so I included a link here to the Nova Scotia Environmental Registry, where requests can be made to obtain copies of approvals for a fee. And there's another regulation that protects wetlands that I wanted to touch on. And so this is the on-site sewage disposal systems standard adoption regulations. They adopt the department's standard on the location of sewage disposal systems. And so this is an example of where we have a policy that is given legal force because it's recognized through a regulation. And so under this standard, sewage disposal systems have to be located at least 30 meters from a surface watercourse, wetland, or marine body. So there's protection there for to protect wetlands as well. But the core right now for wetland protection is done through the wetland alteration approval requirement and process. And so that's all I'll say right now on the Environment Act. So moving on to the Nova Scotia Wetland Conservation Policy. This policy relates to the Environment Act in that it sets out how the department will make its decisions under the Act. It also sets some policy goals and objectives related to wetland conservation. So there is a general goal to prevent the net loss of wetlands in Nova Scotia through wetland conservation practices. And the term net loss means that if a wetland is lost in one area and another equivalent size of wetland is restored in another area, then that would be considered no net loss. And so there is the goal to ensure that the total area of wetland is maintained across Nova Scotia. And then there is a specific objective to have no loss of wetlands of special significance. So these are certain designation of wetlands that the department designates. They include all salt marshes, wetlands within protected areas, wetlands that support species protected under the Federal Species at Risk Act, or the Nova Scotia Endangered Species Act, and any other wetland that's identified by the department. And so there's an objective that none of these special significance wetlands will be lost. And so these goals and objectives will be considered by the department when they're reviewing wetland alteration approvals. So moving on, there are some protections for wetlands under the Forest Act. And it's the wildlife habitat and watercourse protection regulations under the Forest Act that provide these protections, and they apply to all forest harvest sites, so apply equally on private and public lands. These regulations require the creation of a special management zone around watercourses of a certain size. And so this zone has to be at least 20 meters, a 20-meter buffer around the waterway. There is a requirement that these zones be expanded when there is a slope of at least 20% around the boundary of the watercourse. And within the special management zones, the use of forestry operation vehicles is not permitted within 7 meters of the watercourse. There's a requirement to maintain a certain amount of living trees, and there's a requirement to maintain a certain canopy of trees as well within that special management zone. And within 20 meters of all watercourses, including wetlands, the understory vegetation has to be retained to the fullest extent possible. That's the language used in the regulation. And any activity that could result in sediment being dispersed into the watercourse is not permitted. So that's a very, very quick overview of some of the laws that are that the government of Nova Scotia uses to protect wetlands. And relating this back to private landowner wetland stewardship, it's important to be aware of these laws and to follow them, and for those who may not have wetland property, just to be aware of them and watch for opportunities to advocate for them to be followed and strengthened. And so I'm going to move away from the wetland protection laws now and just cover very briefly some conservation options for private land. And I guess these also relate to public lands as well. And so I'll cover conservation easements, designations under Wilderness Protection Act. I won't go into detail about transferring land to a land trust, but I just had it here as it's always an option. So conservation easements are voluntary but legally binding agreements between a landowner and a conservation easement holder with a goal to protect certain features or ecosystems of the land. And the holder of the conservation easement is typically a land trust, but the government can hold conservation easements as well. And these are with a conservation easement, the landowner maintains ownership of the land and continues to be able to use and enjoy the land. However, there are certain activities that are not permitted, so certain property rights that are restricted for the benefit of the purposes of the easement to protect the features of the land and the ecosystems. And so, for example, if there was a piece of land with a significant wetland on it, the conservation easement could outline an area around the wetland, say 100 meters, where no vegetation, no trees can be removed. And so that would be legally enforceable. while still having the ability to potentially remove trees or vegetation on other areas of the land. So these agreements are very flexible depending on the purposes and the ecosystems that are intended to be protected. They can also require the landowner or the land trust to do certain things to support the easement's purposes. And they typically provide a right of the easement holder to monitor the land to ensure compliance with the easement. They also run with the land, which means that they're tied to the title of the land. And if the land ownership changes, any new landowners have to follow the easement as well. And the next option that I'm going to cover is under the Wilderness Areas Protection Act. And so the act is focused on protecting public crown land to conserve land as wilderness areas, to protect biodiversity, natural landscapes, ecosystems, and features. However, there's the ability under the act to include private land in wilderness areas with the landowner's consent. And written consent is registered in against the title of the land. And like the conservation easement, it is also binding on subsequent landowners. So the conservation easement, wilderness area are options where a landowner may want to retain the ability to use and enjoy the land. However, if they wish to see it protected in perpetuity, these are potential options. And the act completely prohibits commercial resource development in wilderness areas, including mining and forestry. And then there's also general prohibitions for several other activities, but some of these general prohibitions some of the activities can be permitted through approval from the department. And that's it for me. So I do just want to point out that we have a resource that East Coast Environmental Law and the Ecology Action Center wrote on wetlands in Nova Scotia in January 2024. So if you want more information, feel free to find the resource. And if you have additional legal questions, you can visit our Environmental Law Inquiry Service, which is a free service designed to provide general legal information to members of the public or organizations, community groups who request it. And you can find more information on our website. You can also send me an email. My email is here. And so I'll pass it on to Gwendolyn now. So I'm going to just switch our presentations here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rochelle.
Okay, and let me know if you see the presentation.
I think we just need to swap the views again.
Okay.
Yeah. We're almost there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
There. Can you see now?
Oh, I think we need to swap view again.
Oh, shoot. Sorry about that.
There we go.
Okay, perfect.
All right, thanks, Rochelle. That was such a great presentation. So much really good information there. And now I'm gonna switch gears and give you some information on the citizen science side. So how we monitor wetlands, in particular, how we monitor bird populations in wetlands. So like Cass mentioned, I'm Gwendolyn and I'm the Marsh Monitoring Field Coordinator at Birds Canada. We've already had a couple of land acknowledgements, but I always like to take a moment to recognize that our programs operate on the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq peoples and the Wabanaki. And Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems. And the two projects that I'll talk about today would not be possible without collaboration with Indigenous communities in the Maritimes. So we're very grateful for their support. So if you've never heard of Birds Canada, we are Canada's only nationwide organization dedicated to the research and conservation of birds. And our mission is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And we have many different avenues of work that we use to achieve our goals, including rigorous research projects and international collaboration initiatives. But one of the biggest components is citizen science projects. Before I go into those two programs, I want to take a moment to step back and think about what wetlands are. And because it is Wetland Appreciation Week, take a moment to recognize how important these habitats are. So a wetland is a dynamic transition habitat between water and dry land. So it's not quite a lake, it's not quite a meadow, it's kind of somewhere in between. And we have many different kinds of wetlands like marshes, bogs, swamps, and especially in the Maritimes, salt marshes. But all of these habitats are united by the fact that they are very waterlogged, so they're poorly drained habitats. And they support unique communities of plants and animals that are highly adapted to these wet and ever-changing environments that go through cycles of drying and flooding. Oh, what's happening? There we go. So why are these environments so important? There are a lot of different ecosystem functions that wetlands perform. So we like to talk about them acting like sponges because water flows into these environments, and then the plants and animals in those habitats filter the water and break down contaminants. And then layers of peat in many of these wetlands, peat being decomposing organic material, soak up the water like a sponge and store it for many, many years. And then the water is slowly released. So it replenishes groundwater and it also flows into other waterways. And wetlands also trap and store carbon. And again, peat is one of the main ways that they do that. And plants in wetlands slow down incoming stream water before this water reaches lakes and oceans. And so this prevents flooding and erosion. And of course, wetlands are really important habitats for a lot of different organisms. So they are critical refueling sites for migratory shorebirds. So actually right now in the Bay of Fundy, there is a huge migration of semi-palmated sandpipers coming through. So these tiny little birds that breed up in the Arctic, and then they fly down to the Bay of Fundy where they stop for a couple of weeks, and they actually double their body weight while they are here. And they rely on, again, these salt marshes and mud flats to get the food that they need before they then go on for another 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers to South America, where they spend the winter. So these wetlands make those journeys possible. And then there are lots of birds that breed in wetlands. So I give you an example here of the sora, which is this fat little cute semi-aquatic bird. It's a wetland specialist. And mallards are an example of a species that doesn't build its nest right at the water, but it brings its chicks to the water after they hatch. And again, these wet places provide protection from predators and lots of food for these growing chicks. And then there are many other species that are not birds that also really rely on wetlands, of course, like muskrats and beavers and all kinds of other amphibians and insects and mammals. And humans also rely on wetlands quite a lot. So one example is the American eel is a species that relies on salt marshes for habitat, especially in their adult form. And they hold a spiritual and dietary significance for the Mi'kmaq people, as they have for many generations. And there are also many edible plants that grow in wetlands, like cranberries, and many medicinal plants like sea lavender. So these are habitats that form the basis of lots of subsistence cultures, especially for Indigenous communities. And then the other earlier functions that I mentioned, like water filtration and erosion and flood prevention, are also really important for human communities, especially in coastal regions. Now, unfortunately, around 2/3 of wetlands have been lost across Canada over the last 200 years, and this includes 65% of salt marshes here in the Maritimes. And based on these numbers, you might think that all wetland species are doing really poorly in terms of their population numbers, but the reality is much more complicated. So we've actually seen in some species, like this Virginia rail, a population increase over the last 50 years. But then there are others like the American bittern, this heron, that have declined pretty dramatically over the same period of time. And these differences between species highlight the need for population monitoring so that we can establish which species need conservation attention. And we biologists cannot do all of the monitoring ourselves, so we use citizen science for a lot of this work. And our first step for recruiting citizen scientists to our program is always to spread awareness and knowledge. Which brings me to the first program I want to talk about, which is Maritime's MarshWatch. So this is a program that we launched this year in collaboration with our partner Nature NB, and it's an introductory program to teach the identification of common wetland birds and amphibians by sight and sound, with some plant ID tips thrown in there. And it's geared towards beginners, but it can be beneficial for all experience levels. And it consists of 5 webinars, which are recorded and posted online, so you can access them whenever you want and as many times as you want to practice your ID of these species. There is also a guided walk component, which this year focused on New Brunswick, but we are looking to expand to Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island as well next year. And the goal of the program is that participants become confident and comfortable enough at the end of the webinars with their ID skills to be able to go out into a wetland and submit a checklist of all the birds that they see and hear on their walk in that wetland in the summer months of June, July, and August. And a secondary goal is the program can be really a good introduction for preparing for the Marsh Monitoring Program, which I'll talk about later, is a little bit more of a more intensive program of population monitoring. So the webinars, the first webinar is an introduction to the program, and it goes into a lot of detail on the wonder of wetlands, what wetlands are, and why they're so important. So a little bit of what I talked about earlier, but again, in much more depth. And then the other webinars, webinars 2 to 5, are the ID sessions where we cover in each webinar 6 to 8 bird species and 1 to 2 amphibians. And we teach you how to identify them by sight and sound. We talk about habitat preferences and diet and throw in some cool facts. And 2 of the webinars, again, have that plant ID component, which is really helpful if you're considering joining our Marsh Monitoring Program, because there is a habitat survey component to that program. So the species that we cover in MarshWatch, we organize them in the webinars based on similar species so that you can start to compare these similar species and pick out the differences between them. So for example, the first ID session we've grouped all of the ducks and geese together so that you can see the differences between them. And overall, the species that we cover, some of them you probably are familiar with, like the mallard or the American robin, and then some of them are much more rare, specialized wetland birds like the Virginia rail. And I've highlighted in bold italics the 12 marsh monitoring primary species. So I'll give a little bit more information about what that means in a bit. But this is just to highlight that we go into a lot of detail about all 12 of those species in MarshWatch, which is why it's a great introduction if you're considering the marsh monitoring program. So to give you a little bit more context on what the ID slides would look like, this is the least bittern. So we start by identifying what kind of bird it is. In this case, it's a small heron. We then go over the body shape. It's compact with short legs. We identify any distinctive coloration or patterning. And if the species has differences between males and females, we show you how to identify both the male and the female, pick out those differences. And again, this is super important for a lot of birds because a lot of birds do have those sex differences, and that can sometimes trip you up when you're in the field. And we also identify habitat so that you can start to train your brain on where you might be seeing each species. And similarly, we talk about diet so that you can learn what sorts of behaviors you might see them showing. Like the least bittern, you'll find them hiding in dense vegetation, and they'll be, foraging by darting their bill down into the water. And very importantly, we also play recordings of the calls and songs of each species. And this is super important for wetland birds because a lot of them don't really like to show themselves. So the only way that you're going to identify them and be able to count them is through their calls. And so we also, in cases where species have a similar call to another species, will give you that comparison so you can, again, train your ear on the key differences. We give you distribution information so that you can see whether you're likely to see the species in your region. And we compare similar species so that you can start to, again, pick out those key differences, which features each species has, and start to memorize, which is which. Especially that's helpful if you've never encountered these species before. And hopefully all of the information that we give you in MarshWatch will inspire you and make you feel comfortable enough to join the Marsh Monitoring Program, which operates across New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. We have lots of routes available for adoption. And I mentioned these target species before, but there are 12 species that we really focus on in this program. And these are wetland specialists. A lot of them are very secretive and therefore difficult to find if you're not actively looking for them. And so this program helps us to track those species. So what a survey would look like is you choose a route, and each route has between 1 and 10 stops. And at each stop, you conduct a 15-minute point count. So what that means is just standing in one place. We have participants play an audio file broadcast on a speaker. And this audio file in the middle 3-minute or 5-minute section, it plays the calls of 5 of the target species. We call this playback. And the reason we use this is because, again, a lot of wetland birds don't like to make themselves known. So we use playback because they will often respond to the call of a member of their own species. And that allows us to count them. So during the 15 minutes, you record all individuals of those 12 target species that you hear or see. And there is also the option to record individuals of non-target species, but you don't have to. The timing of these surveys, they start as early as 30 minutes before sunrise. They don't have to start that early if that freaks you out. But I find that this is really the best time to be out in these wetlands because that's when the birds are most vocal, and you also get the benefit of beautiful sunrises. And then surveys have to end by 10 a.m. So they are morning surveys. Each route is surveyed twice per year, 14 days apart, in the month of June. And on one of those surveys, we ask you to collect some habitat data, which is, again, pretty simple. It just asks you to estimate the percentage of the area in a 100-meter radius of each point that is covered by major habitat types like open water or emergent vegetation like cattails. And there are also, we ask you to identify some key species. So why are these data so important? They allow us to track these secretive wetland species, and they contribute to our understanding of their long-term population dynamics and their habitat preferences. So I have an example on the slide here of some data from the first 25 years of the Great Lakes Marsh Monitoring Program. And you can see how the data allow us to establish these trend lines and visualize what the populations of these species are doing in these regions. And the knowledge of those patterns informs our conservation actions because we can look at those graphs and say which species are not doing great. So for example, in these graphs, the pied-billed grebe has shown a really steep decline over those 25 years. So we might decide to focus our conservation efforts on that species. So if you've been inspired by what you've heard today, it's super easy to get involved in both of these programs. So MarshWatch, we have a website where you'll find all of the necessary materials. And if you have questions after looking through those materials, you can always email me. My email is on the slide there. And for the Marsh Monitoring Program, again, the website is the first place to start because it has all of the resources for understanding the protocol. And again, if you want to practice your bird ID. And if you want to join the program, you'll need to register, and you will do that at the Nature Counts link that I've provided there. Nature Counts is our online database. It's where you will upload your observations after surveys. And if you have any issues or questions, again, you can contact me or you can contact my colleague, Andrew Coughlin. His email is there too. And of course, follow us on social media, and you can also follow Nature NB for any updates on these programs. We're on all of the social media platforms. So with that, I want to thank Nature NB, our partner, for their collaboration, and of course, all of our wonderful supporters for making these programs possible. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions now.
Thanks, Gwendolyn, and thanks, Rochelle, for both of your presentations. So like Gwendolyn said, we're now going to move into the Q&A and discussion portion of the event. So if you have a question, you can ask it over video or by typing it in the chat. If you're comfortable asking it over video, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you when it's your turn. But if you would prefer to type your question into the chat, I can also ask it on your behalf.
Great presentation, Gwendolyn.
Haley?
Hi, sorry. I was just wondering, in terms of like the protections, I was curious about specifically the part where they're talking about like wanting to have no net loss. I'm wondering when you're replacing wetlands though, how much effort is going into is it the same kind of wetlands that are being replaced? Like what does that do to the quality of the ecosystem? Does that make sense? I'm curious about what your guys' thoughts are.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a really important consideration, and it's a common criticism of the kind of offsetting policy for wetlands and other types of ecosystems. And I'm not familiar with the specific policies of the Nova Scotia Department of Environment in terms of of tracking this no net loss policy. I don't know, Gwendolyn, if you have any other insights there, or if anybody else on the call may have insights. But it's a good question, and it's something that I think is important to consider if you're looking at kind of one type of, because there are different types of wetlands, as Gwendolyn pointed out. If one type of wetland is being lost, is the department ensuring that another of the same type of wetland is being restored? So I think important considerations, but I'm not sure the extent that is happening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Sorry, I don't have any other details for you there.
No, no, it's okay. Don't worry. Thank you.
We also have a question in the chat. Jeannie is looking for the best area to see the semi-palmated sandpipers.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I definitely encourage people to go out and see them. It's quite the spectacle. So there are a bunch of locations kind of actually fairly close to the border between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia where they like to land. So one of the best known is in southeastern New Brunswick, and it's called Johnson's Mills, and they have an interpretation center there. And then you can see the shorebirds very, very close up as they are roosting. So that would be my recommendation if it's not too much of a journey. I know that there are also locations in Nova Scotia itself, which I recommend you just have a look online, and there are maps available for if you want to find the closest location to you.
Thanks, Gwendolyn. I can ask a question in case others are still formulating their thoughts. But I had a question about MarshWatch and the Marsh Monitoring Program. So I know you mentioned that most of the monitoring happens like in June and throughout the summer months. So I'm wondering, like, are applications to participate in the more intensive program accepted year round, or like, is there a specific intake timeline that people should be aware of if they want to participate?
In terms of MarshWatch, it's definitely a year-round thing. Those resources are available on the website. You can just log on, whenever you want to. The reason we focus on the summer months is just because that's the breeding season for these birds. And so that's when they're vocalizing and they're the easiest to count. And many of them are also migratory, so they aren't here in the fall and winter. So in terms of signing up for the Marsh Monitoring Program, you can always decide to sign up at any point. And then we will reach out back to you like when the field season is about to start and sort of give you a reminder of, hey, you signed up, a couple of months ago. So again, yeah, whenever you feel like it's the right time, we're happy to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, we just got a couple of comments and questions in the chat. But the first one is, are tools like eBird and iNaturalist equally helpful for researchers in monitoring wetland bird populations?
That's a really great question. Yes, those are really wonderful tools. So for people who aren't familiar with eBird and iNaturalist, these are apps where people can submit observations of eBird is specifically for birds, but then iNaturalist is for all organisms. And so if you happen to see these species, you're out on a walk, you can upload a photo, and then those data contribute to scientific research. So I know that for iNaturalist, it was like there are over 1,000 publications that came out last year that used those citizen science observations. So I always say, whenever you're out and about and you see something cool, you should definitely try to log it in one of these apps. They're super user friendly, and yeah, they really contribute to our knowledge of these organisms.
Great, thank you. We have another comment/question. So Wendy says, recently the Nova Scotia government has rejected the HRM's regional plan that would have increased the riparian buffer from 20 to 30 meters, stating that it would impede housing development. How does this sit with the provincial wetland guidelines? in a non-wilderness area in an urban setting?
Yes, great question. Yeah, we were just chatting. I was just chatting with some of my coworkers about this, the refusal of the increase of the riparian buffer. And to my knowledge, it doesn't it doesn't violate the Environment Act. However, if there are wetlands that are impacted by new developments, of course, those new developments would have to have approval from the department. And so I think the potential loss of wetland that could result from this refusal to increase the buffer could be an advocacy point. So it could strengthen advocacy efforts to increase the buffer because of the potential wetlands that could be lost. However, like I mentioned, the wetland conservation policy is not legally enforceable. It is a guideline for the department. But it's still something that the department has to consider when deciding whether to approve alteration permits for wetlands. And it's still something that advocates could cite as something that the department has committed to doing. So I hope that's helpful. If there are other questions too, relating to that, like I mentioned, we have the Environmental Law Inquiry Service, so feel free to reach out, and we can see what kind of additional information we might be able to provide.
Thanks, Rochelle.
Yeah, no problem.
We did have another similar question in the chat. And I know you just mentioned that this could possibly be used as like a jumping off point for advocacy, but Cynthia is wondering if there's anything else that we can do to like strengthen the existing protections or keep them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there are as far as kind of seeing the wetland conservation policy followed, I think advocating to the Department of Environment itself is a good step because they're the ones who are implementing the policy. And so even they're the ones who have the ability to potentially strengthen the policy. So that would involve maybe letters to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change expressing support for implementing, enforcing, and strengthening the policy. And so that would be one potential step that could be taken, would be advocacy directly to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you. We do have a couple of more minutes. If anybody else has a question they would like to ask, I'll give it another minute or so. And if not, I can just say a couple of words before we wrap up.
I guess I will. I guess I just had another thought on the last question. And it's not something I touched on in the presentation, but the ability of municipalities through their bylaw making powers to put even stronger protections in place for wetlands. And I guess, maybe the HRM is trying to do that and is not getting support, but there is the ability for zoning bylaws and things to account for increased buffers for wetlands and salt marshes and things. So advocacy could also be directed to your local municipality as well. Thanks.
Great addition. Thank you.
I have a quick question. I'm not sure how to raise my hand on here.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead, Emily.
So this is a question for Gwendolyn. I work with Bedeck Waterfront doing some conservation work on Kidston Island, which is a little island just in the Bedeck Harbor. And we did notice an abundance of migratory birds that use this island. So last year we decided to just start recording what birds that we can hear and what ones that we can see. And I'm just using the Cornell Bird app. But I was always wondering, like, how effective it is just recording that I did hear this specific bird or I seen it, but I never know exactly like the number of this species that are actually using the island. So I'm wondering how is it still beneficial to just say that I did hear this bird, but even though I didn't, I don't know how many of them are actually there?
Yeah, I mean, we like to say all data are good data, you know? So anytime you log an observation of a species, that tells us something. Um, a lot of times when you have a lot of migratory birds coming through, it can be very difficult to count them, especially if you're not seeing them, you're going by sound. But we always say that if you can get even a rough estimate, that's useful for us too. So we're not like asking you to sit there and count every single one, obviously, but if you can say, you know, between 200 and 250, like that's still good enough for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So like if there's a specific bird that I pick up on my app and I can't see it, I can only hear it. And I would just assume that it's just the one that's singing, I guess. Like I guess it's kind of hard to determine if there's a few singing that I wouldn't know exactly how many that would be, but yeah. But okay,
Yeah.
good to know.
Yeah, of course.
We do have time for one more question. If anyone has something final to add, or I don't know, Gwendolyn, Rochelle, if you had any final comments to add before I wrap things up.
No final comments other than to say thank you to everyone for joining and for the great questions. And feel free again to reach out anytime with other questions. And thank you, Cass, and Gwendolyn for joining as well.
Yeah, thank you both for having me. And yeah, reach out if you have any questions or if you want to join either of our programs.
Awesome.
Awesome. So thanks again, Rochelle and Gwendolyn, for joining us today and offering these presentations. And thank you to everyone who attended and participated in the discussion. Before we go, I do just want to mention that if you're leaving this call excited about citizen science, the Biodiversity Caucus is currently hosting a summer BioBlitz through iNaturalist, which we talked about a little bit earlier. That's running through to September 2nd. So the goal is to raise awareness of the caucus, celebrate biodiversity, and generate some useful scientific data through citizen science. There will be some small prizes available for winners in multiple categories, including the highest number of total observations, most unique observations, and the best photo submissions. So I'll pop the link to that in the chat in case you want to check out the project.
Awesome.
Yeah, and then finally, a recording of the webinar will be emailed to everyone who registered if you'd like to rewatch it later, share it, and we'll be sure to include all links and resources that were shared throughout the presentation, as well as contact info for each of the organizations that joined us today. And the link will also include links to donate or become an NSEN member if you'd like to get more involved or support our work. So thanks again, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.